Morning, everybody. It's Dan here from CDE, and we're getting. So I'll turn my phone off. Just getting going for our first webinar for 2021 in Australasia on the Engineering Insights series. So welcome to everybody who's dialing in this morning. By way of introductions, this session is We Built This City, assessing the supply and demand for geology construction materials for a global city. And we've got a series of guest speakers and panelists that are helping us today to go through the content. So myself, Dan, will be representing CDE as the regional manager for Australasia. We've also got Mitchell Bland from Corkery & Co. And Dougal Gray, who are going to take us through a paper that was done on the Greater Sydney Basin and the supply and constraints that affect that market. So welcome, guys, and we're really looking forward to the content. And then Damien Christie from Quarry Magazine is going to jump in at the end and help facilitate a panel discussion around the topics that we see in the paper presented by Mitchell and Dougal, but also, I guess, some more thought-provoking stuff as well about the next sort of 5-10 years and the growing cities that we've got around the country. So, look, I won't bore you. We've got a lot of content to get through and really only 45 minutes to get on with it. In terms of the platform, for those that aren't familiar with the platform that we use here at CDE, we've got a Q&A section. So if you'd like to chat to the panelists or ask questions, please go to the Q&A and type a message. We'll either try to get to it on the fly or we'll come back to it certainly at the end. We've also got some handouts and content to be downloaded, so you'll be able to find that on the panel as well. But as I say, we'll get on with the content because these guys are going to be much more interesting to listen to than me. And then we'll come back around and hopefully try to digest it at the end. So over to Mitchell. I think you're going to navigate us through the first part, and we'll talk to you soon.
Well, thanks, Dan. Yes, look, as Dan was saying, Dougal and I are going to be talking about the supply study that we completed on the supply and demand profile for Sydney. So as always with these things, there are a series of thank yous and acknowledgements that we need to make up front. The study was prepared for the Department of Planning to really complement the Greater Sydney Regional Plan. It was certainly very much a collaborative effort between a range of organisations, including Corkery's, RW Corkery & Company, EcoRock, 9 Squared and Ausrox. So today presenting is myself from Corkery's and Dougal Gray from EcoRock. Also like to acknowledge the Institute of Quarrying and the CCAA for their assistance in getting us a whole lot of information. The operators themselves who have fed a lot of information into the report, Quarry Magazine for promoting it, and of course CDE for allowing us to present today. You'll see on the screen there is a link to the report. We're giving you very much just a taster. The report is information dense, to say the least, but there's a lot of really good information there about the market and where we believe it currently is sitting and where we think it's going in the next 15 years or so. So leaping right into the presentation, I'm going to be giving an introduction on the Greater Sydney region, and then Dougal is effectively going to be taking us through the study itself. I think we'll probably hold for questions till the end if we can, Dougal, but please, as Dan was saying, drop questions into the Q&A and then we'll try and get to as many of those as we can at the end. So without further ado, let's launch in. The Greater Sydney Regional Plan really identifies 3 cities within Sydney. So for those, I know I understand there's probably a global audience, but for those who don't know, Sydney's on the east coast of Australia, in New South Wales. The Regional Sydney Plan identifies 3 components to Sydney. You've got a eastern harbour city. I'm going to try and get my drawing tool working here. If this doesn't work, forgive me. Let's try that. So you have, other way around. There you go. Eastern Harbour City is the blue one anyway, which is clearly centred around the Sydney CBD, Sydney Airport, Port Botany, that eastern rim of Sydney and the traditional heart of Sydney, I guess. There's the central river city, which really is centred around the transport hub of Parramatta, which is the geographical centre of Sydney, and an area that's undergoing considerable renewal at the moment. And then the Western Parkland City, which is up until probably a few years ago was sections of it certainly had a very rural character, but it's undergoing enormous redevelopment and growth at the moment, particularly centred around the Badgerys Creek Western Sydney Airport, which not so long ago had dairy cattle wandering around on it. But there's an enormous amount of infrastructure and development happening in that part of the world. Just as a bit of a nod to the original inhabitants, those three regions loosely translate to what the original Eora people called saltwater country, muddy river country, and the running water country. So Sydney currently has a population of about 5 million. I'll jump to the next slide. Oh, sorry, I'll come back to that. So it has a population of about 5 million people. In the next 15 years or so, that's expected to grow by something like 35%. So that's clearly going to have put a whole lot of strains on infrastructure and construction, and particularly around the construction materials. So we've got a short video to play. It's just going to sort of introduce the Greater Sydney Regional Plan.
A growing Greater Sydney needs a plan for its people, great places, housing, jobs, transport and services. The Greater Sydney Region Plan establishes 3 cities built upon our diverse landscape, each unique but connected. 3 cities that will boost our economic, livability and environmental qualities and support Greater Sydney's status as a global city. This plan coordinates population growth with improved or new infrastructure, such as rail, roads, schools and health services. The new Western Parkland City will be key to Greater Sydney's future growth. Home to well over 1.5 million people by 2056, adjacent to the Blue Mountains, Nepean River, the Western Sydney Parklands and a revitalised South Creek. The Western Sydney Airport and surrounding Aerotropolis, supporting tens of thousands of jobs. Greater Penrith, Liverpool and Campbelltown Macarthur will be the university towns, supporting health and education precincts. The Central River City, with Greater Parramatta at its heart. Skilled workers and top 100 businesses will be attracted by better transport links, public places, green space, housing, schools and high-quality neighbourhoods, along with an unprecedented level of infrastructure delivery over the next 10 to 15 years. The Eastern Harbour City, Sydney's traditional gateway, will build upon its strong financial, professional, health and education sectors. A quarter of recent growth in Australia's GDP comes from the economic corridor, from Macquarie Park through Sydney Airport and Port Botany. This plan extends the eastern city's international capabilities through an innovation corridor from the Bays Precinct and the tech and startup hubs in Pyrmont, Ultimo and Redfern to the Camperdown Ultimo Health and Education Precinct. This is a 20-year plan with a 40-year vision, connecting people to great places that recognise local character, housing, transport, including walking and cycling, strategic centres, industrial and urban services, and health and education precincts. It protects and enhances Greater Sydney's environmental green grid. It will provide 725,000 new homes, improving housing affordability with greater choice for buyers and renters, first-timers or downsizers. It supports a minimum of 817,000 new jobs over the next 20 years. And as we travel more in our city, up to 22 million trips per day by 2036, the 30-minute city will bring jobs and services closer to where we live. This plan will protect and enhance Greater Sydney's unique environment, its waterways, biodiversity, bush and rural lands and green spaces. We'll see greener streets and more trees in our suburbs, reducing the risk from natural and urban hazards and improving our resilience to climate change. There are 10 directions at the heart of this plan, a foundation for good city planning across government. Support.
Thanks, Niall. So look, that's a bit of a glossy promotional video from the New South Wales government, but it probably covers off the Greater Sydney plan better than Dougal or I could. I guess one of the things that really just wanted to highlight, and that is the population growth. It is one of the 10 fastest growing regions in the Western world, and for those who live in Sydney already know that it's already a fairly crowded place. So getting that planning right and getting the right infrastructure there is clearly critical for the sustainable development of the city. Dougal, I might let you talk to this one, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. There aren't too many of these horrible slides, but this is important in terms of when we're looking at future demand. So our role was to really try and look at the demand profile for construction materials. And this is really a history of Sydney. On the left-hand side, there's a column showing the annual population growth, and the blue line shows on the right axis shows the actual population growth rate. And there's some projections under the Greater Sydney plan that take us forward into the future, and we've used those in terms of the future demand forecasting. Thanks, Mitch.
All right. Okay, so look, the next couple of slides really, I'm not going to talk to them in detail, but they're really just one of the things that we'll come to later on is when we're looking at assuring supply of construction materials for major urban centres. What's really underpins that process is a really good planning document or planning system, and the Greater Regional Sydney Plan actually has a lot of detail in there about what's the future direction of the city, and without that, it's very hard to actually plan what we're going to be needing. So again, the intention of the Greater Sydney Plan is really to drive this, the infrastructure to then support the lifestyle and the productivity and then the environmental sustainability as well. Look, so just before I hand over to Dougal, I guess a bit of a quick overview of Sydney itself. Sydney certainly has the Sydney Basin. It's constrained to the north by the Hawkesbury River and all the fairly rugged topography up to the north. Clearly to the west, we have the Blue Mountains and the World Heritage areas, and to the south again, some fairly challenging topography, and of course the ocean to the east. So it really is a basin. Geologically, for those who remember the first slide, that was intentionally used. Those cliffs at South Head there are Hawkesbury sandstone. So the eastern part of Sydney is particularly dominated by massive quartz-rich sandstones of the Hawkesbury and the Narrabeen sandstones. To the western part of Sydney is dominated by shales and siltstones and mudstones, with the sandstones at greater depth. There is very little hard rock resources left within the Sydney Basin, so there's no operating hard rock quarries, and there are certainly limited sand operations. So the largest supplier until recently has been the Penrith Lakes scheme system. That's now being shut down, rehabilitated, and returned to other land uses. Clearly, our hard rock quarries, this is just a promotional shot of the Hornsby quarry, are largely now exhausted. So this is I'm not sure if everyone can see this, but there's most of Sydney's extractive materials, natural materials, come from a number of feeder zones. So for the purpose of the study, we've defined the northern feeder zone being the Central Coast, Newcastle, Lake Macquarie, Port Stephens areas. You've got the western feeder zones, so effectively Lithgow and surrounds and Oberon and surrounds, and indeed there is materials coming from further west from there. The materials coming from the north are clearly coming down the M1 or down freeway or via rail. Coming from the west, they're having to work their way across through the Great Western Highway with all the challenges that involves. There's a southwestern feeder zone that is really centred on the Hume Highway, and certainly there are a number of super quarries or very large quarries down around Marulan. and we've got the strategic resource area centred around Albion Park and Wollongong as the southern feeder zone. But all those areas require substantial transportation and have their own supply limitations, I guess. So I think that taps me out. So Dougal, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Mitch. We'll take you through the next sections, really just a quick walkthrough. The report is available for anyone that wants to delve into the detail. In terms of study deliverables, the context was Sydney in 2018 was booming, really massive demand for construction materials. Pretty much people could count trucks in the street. They knew there was a lot of activity going on. The government had quite good data. They collect annual data from the industry who contribute that on a voluntary basis. There was some questions in government, given the growth and the future growth of Sydney, as to how reliable that industry data was. And if it was being underreported, then that could create really quite a problem in terms of planning for future materials. So the study was commissioned. They wanted people that understood Sydney. That's R.W. Corkery. I'm from Brisbane, so not a local boy, but also people that had been involved in modelling supply and demand for extractive materials, construction materials. So it's a consortium put together essentially to provide quite granular detail. We knew how much the big number was. It's 40 million tonnes per year was being consumed in Sydney of construction materials. That's aggregates, recycled materials and concrete. But it was the detail that the study wanted, what they called granular. And here's the slide. It's a bit horrible, but essentially this summarises the key elements. What the City of Sydney wanted to know was, where are the construction materials coming from in terms of hard rock quarries and sand quarries? Also, what are the materials that are being produced? There's a list of them there. They wanted to know where the concrete and asphalt plants were in Greater Sydney and how they were receiving materials. And also an idea on the construction and building sites, really the end use of the materials. So really we're talking cradle to grave. The bogeyman in the whole thing were the recyclable materials. They weren't part of the initial study, but it was clear to Corker and ourselves that we needed to consider those. So essentially that's a cradle to grave snapshot of construction materials flowing through products, transport, and ultimately into point of use. I won't go through this. It's a summary really of the key elements, but really the government wanted to know everything. They wanted granularity and absolute detail. They wanted to know the flows of materials, the quantities, which haul routes they were using, what the ratio of rail was to road transport. We needed to know about regional distribution centres. These are a fairly new, or not new to Sydney, but novel generally in Australia, but essentially these centres within cities that receive construction materials and then redistribute them. Ultimately, we also needed to look at the supply side constraints. The best time to do a study like this is when there's a boom on, because you can see where those supply side constraints are actually kicking in. We ultimately then had to look at the demand supply balance to check and see whether there were enough known geological materials to last till at least 2036. And like I said, we had a look at substitute materials. We're also asked to look at future technology trends and usage trends, particularly in construction sand, manufactured sand and natural sand, availability of this sandstone that lies under the city, and also things like material intensity. In terms of the methodology, really we started off with secondary data, secondary sources, lots of documents, publications, studies and databases. Corkery's did a lot of work to modernise and make sure particularly the geospatial databases that had quarry information in there were accurate. So initially, probably several hundred documents reviewed in the secondary sources. In particular, we relied on economic forecasting data. It was produced by a firm called Macro Monitor. They're a commercial economic forecast data provider. Quite reliable information. There are other companies that also provide that. That gave us a pretty good big picture and some detail on what the expected demand was based on development work in the pipeline. But there's always gaps, and so ultimately we had to go to primary sources. We needed to engage with the Industry Association in Australia, who were absolutely fantastic in terms of facilitating, understanding the big picture. And ultimately we needed to communicate directly with the construction material firms. And there's a bit of work to win their hearts and minds, just in terms of things like confidentiality and probity issues when you're asking quite detailed personal questions about companies' output. In terms of demand forecasting, as I said, for the short to medium term, because there is published economic data available, and it's good data, it's used by the industry, and there's a feedback loop. So essentially, not government data in Australia at the moment, it's not particularly good in terms of economic forecasting for construction materials, but the private sector economic data has really filled that gap. Beyond 8 years, the development pipeline becomes a bit fuzzy, and so we've had to revert to the traditional longer term forecasting method, which is to really multiply anticipated population by per capita demand. There's pros and cons, but essentially it's less reliable, that method. And our point is, if you've got good economic data based on what's in the development pipeline in your city, use that at least up until the time that it's relatively valid. Then beyond that, you've got to revert to these per capita consumption methods, and they require various assumptions. Challenges and limitations, like all studies, it's a big city, there's hundreds of stakeholders involved, there's caution about confidentiality of information, there's concern about motives, particularly if the industry, some parts of industry were worried that the government might put it to unknoble causes. So quite a lot of headwinds encountered. Part of the role of the job of the study project team was to navigate through those, and we did, and we'll highlight where we found inconsistencies and uncertainties. In terms of what we found, firstly, Corkery's established a reliable contemporary hard rock geospatial database. A lot of information in that database, but the data in it is preserved, so that there's no breach of confidentiality, no individual quarry's output can be established from it. It's amalgamated by these feeder areas. It's for planning purposes and no other, but it's quite reliable and accurate. And likewise for natural sand, 27 quarries supplying into Sydney. 63% of that supply is actually outside Greater Sydney, 37% from within Sydney. And there's some numbers there on average road and transport distances. I guess hard rock, should point out, about 2/3 of supply of hard rock, all from outside the city, is coming in by road, and about 1/3 by rail. We also established where the concrete asphalt plants were, and these regional distribution centres where the aggregates are brought in, usually by rail. There's batching of materials on site, and then some redistribution of those materials to other concrete and asphalt plants. The numbers are there for the users of the materials. We also need to look at recycling plants, and there's a database established there. What we actually found, well, this is a snapshot of the construction material demand in Sydney 2018, and about 40 million tonnes up the top there. Per capita consumption, a bit over 8 tonnes per annum. That's an historical high for Sydney. This is a boom time. When we surveyed the market, we found about 13.6 million tonnes of hard rock crushed products supplying the city, 6 million tonnes of natural sand, cementitious materials there, and also this big number down the bottom, 16.7 million tonnes of substitute materials. These are sandstones and recycled materials. So the analysis showed a very high reliance, at least in some markets, of those substitute materials. This is a summary projected into the future, showing the various categories down the bottom, the hard rock, other sources, and the cementitious products. I mean, the upshot is, over the next 19 years from this study, about 772 million tonnes of these materials required by the city, based on what we call a base case projection. That's before we started to play around with sensitivities. And again, here's some, excuse me, some hard numbers coming in, showing the breakdown of forecast construction material demand using the base case. And you'll see that substitute number in there, 42% in 2018. very high by, I would suggest, global city standards, certainly within Australia. And fundamentally, we think driven by the availability of sandstone, a lot of that coming from tunnelling works. It's a 30-minute city. That's the vision for the city. So there are tunnelling works underway, have been for a while, and planned for the future. They, plus other civil dig-out material, are producing a lot of this sandstone. And the question for us, or for the city, we think in the future, is what happens when the geology changes and the city grows as it grows to the west, where there's less sandstone and more shale and siltstone. Maybe there's going to be more reliance placed on quarries as a source of materials, and yet those hard rock quarries are all outside the city. These are the various profiles that we were asked to establish. So we're looking at really demand and supply. We're considering demand and supply to be synonymous for the purposes of forecasting. So here's a profile, the different types of hard rock products, natural sand down the bottom there, and we've given you some details on the breakdown on the right. 2 points of note: the amount of road base that's actually provided by the hard rock quarries into Greater Sydney is really low by any standard, and that tells us that there's a high level of substitution in that particular category coming from recycled materials and sandstone. The other highlight is the nexus, the relationship between manufactured sand, fine crushed aggregate, and natural sand. That's changing and it's evolving, but both product categories are obviously relevant to future demand and supply. Ultimately, you can conduct a cumulative analysis if you've managed to do a year-on-year forecast, and this is the cumulative analysis. So we're estimating, based on the current percentages of quarry material versus non-quarry material, about 383 million tonnes required over the next 19 years to 2036. We'll move to concrete. We're also asked to look specifically at concrete as well. And here's a similar profile, broken down by the aggregates and also the other constituents: ground granulated blast furnace slag, fly ash, and cement. These data are very reliable. We think the industry certainly thought the numbers were about right. And again, these data come from Macro Monitor, who've been publishing and working on this material for many years. They produce biannual data, and you can purchase that data, and that's what we did for this study. Again, there's a cumulative demand forecast for concrete. So that's pre-mix, precast concrete, and mortar mixes. We also looked at the demand profile. So this is the same demand profile as for the extractive materials by manufacturing sector, which picks up asphalt and concrete segmented by precast and premix, but also the materials that we know go directly to site. And again, the same results: about 19.5 to 20 million tonnes of those of materials, extractive materials. That's from quarries going into that market as of 2018. And again, to finish off sort of the end of use, this is the use of, again, quarry materials by their end use or their point of use, and we split this between housing, non-residential buildings, road construction and maintenance, and other engineered construction. There's a lot of good data published in Australia by ABS and the economic forecasters on this. So we've really just converted, if you like, the demand profile, match the aggregates that are placed into these particular sectors. And finally, just in terms of closing the loop, these are our findings in relation to substitutes. So these are the materials like the sandstone that's dug out of civil construction sites in Sydney, and recycled materials, particularly concrete. These were our best estimates based on what we think's going on. But the point here is that we didn't get a lot of buy-in from recyclers. They were concerned about studies for quarry materials. Some saw themselves, not all, but some saw themselves as competitors. And so we had to use our best endeavours and secondary market sources to try and put this information together. and it's not particularly, it's our best guess. We think that further work should be done in this area because of this very high reliance that our study found on these materials. Supply side issues, we looked at transport costs. Rail's about a third of road. There is some shipping, obviously cementitious materials, there's some aggregates being shipped back in from some of the southern feeder areas back into Sydney. We also looked at constraints, particularly these supply side constraints that industry reported. There's quite a detailed discussion in the report on that. No real surprises, all the things that you'd expect. Quarries in boom conditions and having to cart material a long way might put forward. But in many respects, you know, they are issues that we need to try and resolve or at least minimise to reduce the costs and the imposts on all of society. The other fundamental issue with constraints is because the quarries are outside Sydney, you're really looking at local needs and local amenity issues, and the local people that are along those haul routes around those quarries always ask this question: well, why should we tolerate quarries producing higher output? What's in it for me? That's that tune into WIFM. In terms of the demand supply balance, we found that there's enough hard rock reserves, approved quarry materials to meet demand to 2036. Most of the quarries have established reserves. There are still some future approval adjustments and amendments required, but in terms of approved hard rock, it's a long way out, a lot of it, but it is there. Sand's a different story. We don't see that natural sand reserves will last. We think they'll certainly be under pressure in the early 2030s, and there's going to be a requirement there for more natural sand quarries, despite the fact that manufactured sand from hard rock quarries is increasing. And the demand supply balance, obviously, in the future also needs to look at these community need issues, these important matters of public and planning need, including cost, competition, convenience, choice, and capacity. You know, there's no point having, say, two quarries producing, 100% of the market. There's obviously community benefit in there being diversity of supply. They were the main findings from the study, so not really particularly contentious. The key thing, there's a lot of detail in the study about the roads, the routes. We give a lot of breakdown information. It was granular data the government wanted. We knew about the 40 million tonnes, but what's the breakdown? And so the study got there in the end. In terms of where to from here, there's always ways to improve things. Geological materials, particularly the reporting of those, is an issue. What counts as what gets counted is the axiom. So there's work to be done there in terms of, I guess, industry being able to contribute that information to government, confident that it's going to be used for planning purposes and not other darker purposes, if you like. Substitutes for geological materials. We really see this as an area where there's more to learn in Sydney. So we certainly encouraged the government and other stakeholders to really take this seriously and understand better what the contribution is from these materials and what their trajectories for use might be in the future. Cementitious materials also, there's a discussion in there because Australia is increasingly importing cement, clinker, fly ash and ground granulated blast furnace slag. That has implications for port facilities and obviously the intermodal connections between the ports to rail to distribute those across the city. And economic forecasting data, well, there's always a question as to what data you use. In Australia, like I said, there's good private sector data. I don't particularly see the need for government to try and emulate that, but there's always a question in government as to whether or not it should use private data or its own. And to conclude, benchmarking with other global cities, we really just pose a series of questions here. Are there things that we can learn from other cities, and are there things that other cities might learn from us in the conduct of studies of this type? And here's some questions. We were asked this quite a lot in the study. What do these demand and supply profiles for other global cities look like? We know in Australia, Brisbane, Melbourne and Brisbane have higher per capita consumptions, and they use a lot less substitute materials, different profile. But we were interested in the availability of data from other global cities in terms of being able to at least sort of do some benchmarking. And is benchmarking even a useful exercise? Is there a template that we could use to compare ourselves with other global cities? Are there analogues that we might be able to use to better communicate the needs of construction material producers in terms of being able to supply the market? And one analogue is obviously a city's water supply and reticulation. You need a full reservoir, but you also need pipes of the right capacity and kept and well maintained. And yeah, ultimately, what can we learn and share from the experience of other global cities? My personal view is I think there's probably a lot to learn and share. And to some extent, governments like benchmarking activities. They like to know what London might be doing or Dublin might be doing, just in terms of more reassurance, I guess, of the veracity of their of data that we produce for studies like Sydney. So really, that's it in terms of the presentation and what we found. And thank you all, and I'll hand over to Damien.
Thanks very much, Dougal. It's great. Both congratulations to you and to Mitch for the presentation. Really well done. It's great actually to finally see it make the light of day, because obviously I first became aware of the study back in 2018 when you were working on it then. So it's and it's important that this information is out there, and that members of the extractive industry are both within New South Wales, across Australia, really globally, are aware of this sort of information and the kind of challenges that await the extractive industry globally. I guess, yes, just turning to some of the Q&As. Obviously, with question one, you discussed some of the challenges and the limitations you had with the study, in particular the reluctant buy-in of some of the quarries into the process, and also of some of the recycled aggregate producers. What do you think needs to be done to earn the trust of these parties, so that in the future more valuable data can be requested from them?
Yeah, Mitch, do you want to...
Yeah, I'll jump into that one. Look, I think there's probably two aspects of that. The regulators need to be viewed, or government needs to be viewed as a partner in the process. So there's certainly a perception around operators that the regulators and the government is no longer there to assist them, but there to prosecute them. So that tends to make people pull their heads in. And I guess the other side of that is the quarry operators and the recyclers in particular need to see a benefit coming out of this. So this is a brilliant study that sort of really identifies how things are going to be moving around. But then what's the feedback for that? Does that then mean that there is a greater emphasis on facilitating planning approvals and overcoming hurdles for the companies by participating in these surveys? And if you don't get both of those two right, then I suspect that the companies will continue to be unenthusiastic.
Okay.
I guess just quickly to add, in terms of what can be done, there is a good working relationship. The industry currently most quarries provide data annually to government. The CCAA, the Industry Association in Australia, very, very helpful in terms of introducing us to the industry. But I guess ultimately there is what we call a cynicism gap. That's this mistrust between government and the private sector. It's a global issue. It's not just in Australia. We see it happening around the world. We see that gap widening. Ultimately, it's communication. It's relationships, particularly between, I suspect, industry associations and government, where they realise there's mutual benefit in sharing information, in legitimate information, in a way that can really benefit the greater good. And that sounds a bit sort of idealistic, but ultimately that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about community need for homes and schools and hospitals and stuff. So that relationship is there. It's certainly there in New South Wales, but it needs careful maintenance. And as Mitch said, you can destroy it instantly, particularly if there's any perception by industry that the government might use the data for nefarious purposes.
Okay, moving on to the next question. I guess, Dougal, in the presentation you talked about the definition you talked about substitute construction materials, which account for 42% of the 40 million tonnes of quarry production demand in sort of the FY 2018 period. I assume you're you're referring, for example, to say things like sandstone venom and other materials that are coming out of construction projects and spoil projects and so on. I guess why are these materials, I guess, so vital, and I guess what sort of projects require them?
Thanks, Damien. Yeah, well, certainly to confirm, so substitutes in the study, they're actually defined at the front end, but really two categories. The sandstone material, I mean, venom, I think, is an acronym for virgin excavated natural materials. It's a bit of a New South Wales thing. These are the surplus in cut from civil projects, whether it's tunnelling or basements for high-rise or roadways or whatever. These are the materials that are pulled out of the earth and need to go somewhere because they're not required on the project. Sydney's endowed with this Hawkesbury sandstone, at least in the eastern part of the city. And so these materials essentially, as best as we can understand, really replace road-base, sub-base, hard stand materials, engineered and select fills, materials that might be used to fill sort of, voids. So really used in large quantities, low value, generated within the city, and from a sustainability perspective, fantastic. What a great thing for Sydney. Other cities that might be built on mud or clay don't have that option. As a consequence, really what that allows for is the hard rock quarries to really maximise the yield of aggregates that they produce for concrete and asphalt. And so what we found in the study is that the hard rock quarries supplying into Sydney really produce very little road base. And why would they if there's these substitute materials readily available at very low costs? So we see them as a great benefit to Sydney. We think they've been taken for granted, and we're not sure that they'll prevail into the future as the geology of Sydney changes, as Mitch pointed out. And what does that mean? Because really what we find, the hard rock quarries at the moment are pretty much at maximum yield in terms of, a ton of hard rock through the crushers producing X percentage of aggregate. They don't really have that much leeway to start switching to road base. We don't see that that'll probably be needed for a while. But our question is, well, what happens when the geology changes and as Sydney grows to the west? And recycled materials, of course, again, we didn't get a really good handle on this. It wasn't part of the original study. We had to go there. We couldn't get a lot of buy-in. I'll be frank. It's a difficult market. It's a different market in many respects to talking directly with construction material companies. Yes, some own recycling companies. At the time of the study, there was some acquisition activity going on around the place as well, and speculation. It's about the last place you want to be, or no one wants to listen to consultants poking their nose into your business. I guess one of the comments, with a lot of good data collected by the government, both at state and federal level, but what we found is it's not particularly useful if you're trying to understand where recycled materials end up. How much recycled material actually goes into concrete, low-value concrete and high-value concrete. We know about asphalt, got a good handle on that, but really massive amounts of C&D waste, particularly concrete, and the bulk of it's going into engineered fills and road base as well. But there's obviously a percentage going into higher value uses, and we see that as an area, Damien, where really the industry as well as government, in terms of construction material planning, I think could improve upon.
I guess just to highlight Dougal's point there, when you're looking at the risk side, we really don't have a handle on what's the drop-off in that availability of that material as the construction focus moves to the west of the city, where the materials are less suitable for particularly engineered type fills.
So moving from that sort of substitute construction materials to, I guess, natural sand reserves, you sort of indicated in your slides that there are additional natural sand reserves available, particularly in geology that's, I guess, adjacent to existing sand quarries. Is the quantity of these reserves potentially known? Is there any restrictions on access to those reserves that either of you are aware of?
Mitch, I'll hand over to you in a sec. Yeah. Just one clarification. With probably resources, we should talk sand resources, Damien.
Yep.
Reserves are that which are essentially, under Australian terminology, generally those which are approved and known. Resources are those which are partially known, but maybe not approved. I'll hand back to you, Mitch.
Look, so yeah, that's a useful introduction. Look, certainly there are resources that we're aware of. Yes, as you say, indicated Damien. There are districts, and I'm thinking particularly Maroota in the more northern part of Sydney and elsewhere, where there are substantial reserves that are known but are yet to be approved. They have their own challenges. Sand by its particularly sand by its own challenge has its own challenges, particularly around the environmental side of things. So you do get some groundwater, you get good, there's really good vegetation. Do you really want to be pulling out, destroying aquifers for this decade's concrete manufacturing when you need that aquifer in for the next 100 years? That's so there's those constraints. So look, there's certainly resources available or identified that we know about but are yet to be approved. And there are manufactured options that may well substitute for some of those resources. And there are processing technologies that may be able to turn some of particularly our waste stone, into suitable material. But I guess that's probably one of the big unknowns that came out of this is how are we going to secure that really essential material for the future without having to be transporting it many hundreds of kilometres from south or west or north.
From the capital side, I think possibly this is one where CDE can chip in a bit as well and comment. And you guys opened up the report by talking about Penrith Lakes, and Sydney was blessed to have a beautiful supply of sand, which was very clean, and it sort of got addicted to this ultra high quality sand, and some of the standards have been built around that. And you're talking about the water requirement and some of those costs of sand washing or sand beneficiation. And again, some of that is made worse by the standards that are required by the industry, which perhaps something could be looked at, particularly again as recycled material comes into the market. So lower quality feeder sands and recycled material coming into the market is, do we need to now review the standards rather than trying to make every sand like a Penrith Lake sand when it doesn't need to be? And I think there's some work to be done in that space as well. But we can absolutely do it. The engineering and the process equipment's out there, but perhaps it's not the right thing to be doing to chase perfect when in a lot of the case, the good is good enough.
Absolutely. And look, the other thing I'd identify too is the one thing that we haven't really covered off on in our assessment is there is an enormous resource of marine sand offshore, which has in the past had a fair bit of attention. I'm starting to get some more attention now, but that may well be one part of the solution.
I guess that's a good. Sydney's just resisted, obviously, you tapping into those resources, Mitch. Brisbane, interestingly, went down the different path, and so 1 million tonne a year of fine sand is dredged out of Moreton Bay, essentially for navigation and sort of navigation into the port of Brisbane. And without that, Brisbane would literally be in major difficulty with fine sand. So that's just an example, I guess, of how different cities decide how they should use the resources that are available to them. But they do have profound consequences. And in terms of the processing issue, Dan, one of the issues with the dig out the friable sandstone is it can be washed. It's a high silt content. It can certainly be washed. But where are those washing facilities? How do you get development approvals for those in city areas? And I think you're absolutely right. There's work to be done there.
Yeah, your logistics piece is really interesting in that as well, because at the moment, those materials usually get carted a long way out of the city and maybe then get processed to be brought back in. And maybe this is where processing closer to the source makes a lot of sense from a logistical point of view and a cost-based point of view. And like I say, the Hawkesbury sandstone has been like a bit of a shock absorber for the Sydney market, where as extraction and construction has increased, so has the supply of this venom material. So, and that comes to your benchmarking comment. And, we have the benefit of, I guess, being involved in a lot of markets around the world, and no two markets are the same. Even between Brisbane and Sydney, the economics, as you just described, are very different. So politicians will love to benchmark, but I think it's a very hard thing to do.
Yep.
I'm a little bit cognizant of the time, so I'll jump ahead a couple of questions. You indicated in the study that hard rock quarries will probably eventually have to come on board to cover the shortfall in the crushed sandstone. But obviously they're quite busy with orders for their own mainstream products. Do you think New South Wales government agencies need to consider offering some form of incentive or subsidy to hard rock quarries to encourage them to look at producing manufactured sands? And maybe even a question that you, Dan, can also sort of jump in on, potentially subsidise the investment in plant and equipment required for such production.
So,
I
look,
guess just study-wise, certainly our discussions with the major companies is if they can make manufactured sand, they are. And without going into individual firms, there's a lot of work being done, obviously, in the Australian market over the last 20 years on that, particularly in the medium coarse fraction. But there's still crusher fines going to waste and scalps and other materials in the quarries, or at least being put into sort of uneconomic stockpiles. What we found is that is an issue. If you're going to have an oversupply or a generous supply of sandstone, you actually generate waste at the hard rock quarries. I mean, that's what happens. And it seems to be happening in the feeder areas to some extent. Mitch, I'll hand over to you in terms of the guts of the question.
Look. I think there's the engineering challenges around manufacturing sand at quarries, but I guess there's also the economic assessment, and invariably when you introduce government intervention into a market, it distorts the market, and so you then start influencing the economics. And so if the quarry operators can be manufacturing a sand that is as good a product as the natural sand for a lower price, then that segment of the market will naturally expand. So look, to answer your question, Damien, I don't think government intervention is particularly useful, but certainly it is something that we'd certainly be encouraging the operators to be looking at, and I think it'll be coming naturally anyway.
I think globally, guys, what we've seen is the moratorium on river sands has pushed a lot of markets this way. If they say no more extraction of river sand, then manufactured sand becomes a must, and we see that driving. So legislation driving behaviours. But yeah, there's lots of different mechanisms there. But the question is valid. Is that the case? And is that the mechanism we want to be using in our markets locally? And I think the jury's out on that.
There's an equity consideration as well, because we've got a lot more sand producers, greater ownership spectrum. There's aesthetic issues as well, obviously just the colour of the material. So you'd certainly have to be concerned from a community perspective if there was a concentration of sand manufacture literally from a handful of hard rock quarries, but just in terms of distribution as well. So I understand the sentiment to obviously stop river iron and marine dredging. There's consequences because there's big licks of capital need to go into manufactured sand, but more so than into a sand plant.
Okay. Obviously, other Australian governments have done similar studies to this, including the Victorian government to the south of Sydney, and they have basically created or devised an extractive industry priority project list, which gives priority planning consideration to quarries that are in local government areas with the highest demand for wall construction materials. Are you aware if the New South Wales government agencies involved in this are considering a similar approach to fast-tracking quarry applications for the Greater Sydney region? Is it an approach they should be considering, and other cities around the globe should be considering?
Look, I'll probably jump in on that one. Look, there is no formal, certainly not that Corkery is aware, there's no formal extractive industries priority list that focuses on particular projects. There is certainly identified resource areas. So I'm looking at Albion Park, for example, in the southern feeder area, where development is being managed so that we're not having the quarries squeezed out by encroaching urban development, and that's incredibly important. So I think where the New South Wales planning system is doing well in some areas and less well in others, is protecting some of those really high value resources that we're going to need for a long time. And I think there should certainly be more done in that area just to ensure that we're not getting squeezing of our quarry operators by encroaching development. The way the New South Wales planning system is, and I think it's a hard-baked issue, is it's things are done on a project by project basis. That's not inappropriate. So look, I think there would be significant community resistance if projects were given effectively a green light before they were ever assessed. But there is certainly challenges in the planning system around timeframes, around cost, around the Dougal highlighted some of this before the WIIFM. Those people who are getting the amenity and the other impacts are not necessarily the ones benefiting from the actual projects themselves, because the material's going into Sydney, whereas the quarries themselves are located regionally. So look, I think there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done around that area. But the thing where government can really contribute is to be protecting those high value resource areas.
Okay, and just to round off, I guess what other cities around the globe can perhaps learn from the Sydney experience and even from the Melbourne, Brisbane experiences?
Well, Damien, I think it's a two-way process. Certainly, this study it went to a lot of detail, and the way we segmented the data and the way those profiles were put together shows a reasonable flow, if you like, from cradle to grave, and in fact the recycling loop back again. And we'd suggest it's not a bad way to look at demand profiles. We'd certainly be interested in whether profiles have been done for other cities. In terms of benchmarking, Dan, I heard Dan's views and I agree with him. It's often can be a race to the bottom if you benchmark yourself with somebody who's not. But I think there is benefit in benchmarking, at least in understanding some of the situational dynamics that go on between cities. And what we found when we were engaging with government is, when we were producing we said, look, 42% of your materials are coming from non-quarry sources, and some of the reaction was nonsense. What do the other cities do? What about London? What about Dublin? What about Melbourne? What about Auckland and so on? And we went, well, we don't know. I don't know. I mean, we actually searched the internet to try and find studies of this nature. I think there could be some benefit. Literally, you could almost do it in a 1 or 2 page summary. If for nothing else, it stimulates discussion and about our own city's needs. And I guess the takeaway message for Sydney was, well, goodness me, geology matters. We know that in the construction material game. But this is to planners.
Great.
We said, no. What's under your city actually matters, because guess what? You're going to dig it out with your tunnels and metros and highways. And you can't do that in other cities, or you can. You've got to get rid of the gunk. So we'd certainly be interested in what other cities are doing. And I think there is benefit for the industry as a whole. It adds a type of legitimacy if you're asked to do these studies, and you can say, well, this is what they do in New York and this is what they're doing in Paris. We're Australia. We're always interested in what's happening over there overseas.
Yep. And look, I guess I understand we've got less than a minute left, but I guess I'd probably conclude that comment, support that totally, Dougal. But the other comment I'd add to that is, I think it's really the thing that others can learn from Sydney, and I think Sydney has done really well, is this really robust planning framework. The Greater Sydney Plan, which really identifies where the city wants to move in the next 20 years. Because without that, you're really then shooting in the dark as to what your demand side is going to be.
Yeah. Great summary, guys. Damien, I think we do need to wrap up there. And from CDE's point, guys, thank you both very much for taking the time today to talk us through the report. And like Damien said, a few of us have been aware of it for its presence for a couple of years now, but it's lovely that it's starting to come to the surface now and be considered. And I think it's a great tool and a credit to yourselves for how you pulled it together in such professional and a robust way. And I think as you delved into it, you showed that you've responded to the things you saw, which is mainly around that venom piece and those gaps. And to say, thanks to you both for taking the time to talk us through it today, and hopefully it's for our audience. It's been thought-provoking and some compelling stuff. The economics around it are certainly one to pique interest, I think, for people who are looking to invest in the space and plan for the future of Sydney.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, guys. For all those online, we'll be kicking off in about a minute on our next piece, which is more around resource recovery from landfill and waste streams. And I'd promote you all to stick around and take part. Thanks.